Good morning, everybody. We're going to start a new chapter today, Siman Zayin, Dine Gezela Ugeneva, Ubo Lamedalad Seifim, the laws of stealing, and there are two words in Hebrew for stealing. One is called Gezela, and the other one is called Geneva. And usually we translate Gezela as robbery and Geneva as theft. Because one involves aggressive behavior and the other one involves stealthy behavior. Okay, so let's take a look at the general halacha first, which is pretty straightforward. Asur ligzol o lignov kol shehu din Torah. It is forbidden biblically to steal anything according to the Torah, Bain mi Yisrael, Bain mi Nachri. This prohibition applies in both stealing from a Jew and from stealing from a non-Jew. Bain Gadol, Bain Katan. It applies to stealing from an adult and stealing from a minor. Va'afilu im hanochri tzier et Yisrael. And this is true even if the non-Jew whom you wish to steal from has caused the Jew pain or other kinds of agony. Tsar shelo shayach bo tashlum. We're talking about a pain that is not subject to compensation. Let's just say he makes your life miserable, right? And he can't, but there's no way to seek compensation for that. You do not have a right to steal from him. The alfal pisha pachot mishava pruta eno nikra mamon. Now another topic. What about stealing a trifling amount from someone? Something that's less than what's called a shava pruta. Now, a shava pruta means something that's worth a minimal coin of denomination in the times of the Talmud. With a pruta, you could probably buy a little bit less than a meal for a day. So even stealing a small amount, even though that's not considered to be money, halachically in Jewish law, ve'ein sarich lahashivo, and you're not obligated to return it if you do steal it. But nonetheless, harei chatzi shir asur min haTorah lechatchila. But we still know that even though it's not called stealing money, when you steal less than a shava pruta, the Torah still prohibits us from eating less than a full amount. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a fast day. I forgot I'm not fasting. I was about to take a drink because my allergies are acting up. But nonetheless, harei chatzi shir asur min haTorah lechatchila. But nonetheless, the Torah forbids even doing less than the requisite amount. Now, what we mean by that is that the Torah prohibits me, for example, from eating on Yom Kippur, right? Now, what is the definition of eating according to the Talmudic interpretation? It is eating a kezayit, an olive size worth of food. Does that mean that permission is granted to eat less than an olive size worth of food on Yom Kippur? No, it does not. And the Torah does prohibit eating less than an olive size worth of food because there's a concept called chatzi shiur. Now, there's a machlokes as to whether chatzi shiur, less than the requisite amount, is biblically prohibited or it's rabbinically prohibited. But either way, the Rav Shulchan Aruch paskins that it's even biblically prohibited. And as a result, he says that you're not, at least lechatchila, at least before the fact, and therefore he paskins that you're not allowed to steal from someone even less than a shava pruta. V'imhu davar mu'at kol kach she'ein mi sheyakbid klal alav. Now, if it's something that is so minuscule that no one would even mind, no one would even care if you took it, kagon litol kisim Mehachavila or mehagader lachtzotz bo shinav. And the example that is provided in the in a medieval context is, let's say, to take a little splinter of wood from a bundle of wood. Let's say a guy has, what do they call it, a cord of lumber, a cord of firewood, and you happen to see like a little splinter protruding from one of the logs. So you pull it off because you're looking for something to clean out in between your teeth. Okay, so would the lumber yard mind if you did that? No, of course not. The lumberjack doesn't care about the little splinters. Or if you're walking past a wooden fence and you see a splinter protruding out of one of the slats of wood, does the slat owner mind? It's going to fall off anyway eventually, that splinter. Does he mind if you take it and use it as a toothpick? Of course not. And therefore it's mutar. And therefore you're allowed to take such a thing even off of property that does not belong to you. However, umidat chasidut limnoa gam mizeh. But it is still considered an act of piety to refrain even from that. Even from that, it is proper to refrain from that kind of behavior because, and one of the reasons, by the way, is to train yourself to respect the property of others and not to engage in taking anything that is outside of your purview. All right, so that's the basis of this halacha. That's the standard first halacha of the laws of Geneva and Gezela. Let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. So Aleph in the Imrei Yaakov is Asr Ligzolo Lignov. Kosov Haram Kol Hagonev Mamon Mishava Pruta Umaila. Over alo ta'aseh, shenemar lo tignov. Anyone who steals a monetary amount that is higher than that is worth a shava pruta or higher is in violation of a negative commandment, as it says, "Thou shalt not steal." Ve'ein lokin alabzeh, but you don't get malchus. We don't normally when you do an act, let's say like eating something not kosher. The penalty is malchus. The penalty is lashes, but we don't give lashes for theft. And the reason is shaharei nitam l'tashlumin shahaganav chiyavoto Torah l'shalem ad kan l'shana. Because anything that can be rectified through restitution is not subject to lashes. So since a ganav can make restitution for his crime by paying back the amount that he stole, he's not subject to lashes. So that's the statement of the Rambam. Va'od ayin beperak aleph mehilchos, perak aleph halacha aleph mehilchos gezela. And I refer you further to look into the Rambam as well. And the isser gezel hu lav davka sheshaleach yado mamash b'mamon chavero lekachto ulesimo bekelav. He says you should know that the prohibition of stealing is not specifically or not is not literally all the time placing your hand in someone else's money and taking it for yourself and putting it in your own possession. But in any situation where the assets of another person comes into your possession, not legally, that's also a form of gezel. K'maimer Chazal, rov begezel umiyut ba'arayot. As our sages tell us, that most people in life end up stumbling in the laws of stealing. A minority of people end up sinning in the laws of arayot, of sexual crimes, but the majority of people at some point in their lives invariably will trespass over the laws of stealing. Upirish Rashi, and Rashi explains, Shemorin lehetera b'masa umatan la'akev ish mirevach haroi lo lechavero. That people rationalize when it comes to the laws, when it comes to monetary issues. We always rationalize to ourselves that to convince ourselves that something that objectively is wrong can be justified. Okay, to hold on to something that really we're not entitled to. Because of Hachazon Ish, shegidrei hagezel einam niftarim al pi da'at b'nei adam rak al pi chukei haTorah. And it's on that basis that the Chazon Ish writes that the parameters of what is considered stealing cannot be assessed by human reason alone, but rather must be examined through the lens of the parameters set down by the Torah and the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And the reason, of course, is because human interpretation of what is stealing and what is not stealing can always be rationalized or written off based upon our own subjectivity. V'chol shehu neged hadin hu gezel, af she'ein b'nei adam maskimim aleim bebechinat haregesh. And therefore, anything that is contrary to the law as it is set down in our code books is considered to be gezel, even when people rationally come to a different conclusion. If people feel differently, that this should not be considered theft, but the halacha says it is theft, then it is defined as theft. And so it's a very elusive, sometimes kind of issue to analyze, because sometimes society may deem something to be not stealing when halacha may deem it to be stealing. We'll try to get to some concrete examples of that, but for now we're just looking at the parameters. Ligzol or lignov, it is forbidden to do gezel or geneva. And remember, we normally translate gezel as to rob, and to be gonev is to steal. Achiluk ben ganaf legazlan hu. He says, what's the difference between a ganaf and a gazlan? Even though in modern parlance, in just, colloquial parlance, we use the two interchangeably, is the ganaf hainu shalokech mamon chavero beseser. He says a ganaf is someone who steals with stealth. She'ein haba olim yodi'im mizeh, where the person who is being stolen from is unaware. Or the owner is aware that someone is stealing, but the stealer hides his identity, like someone who commits credit card fraud or steals your credit card over the internet. As frustrating as that is, that's all called geneva, because you can never trace the identity of the person. They're able to cover their tracks. Okay. But a gazlan is someone who forcibly or aggressively robs from you. Like a guy, I'm holding something in my hand, and a guy just comes over to me and grabs it out of my hand. Or he comes into my property, into my home, and basically just robs me against my will. Another example of gezel is if he takes hold of my animals and uses them without permission. Or he steals my car. All of these examples are called gezel. And there's a story in Nach where Benayahu, who was a Kohen, steals a spear from the hand of the Egyptian. V'hani mili beinehem, in other words, there you do it forcibly, where you're not hiding your identity. V'hani mili beinehem de'ein hagazlan chayev bekefel. He says, in all of these situations, the gazlan is not liable to pay any penalty other than to make restitution for what he stole. And similarly, if he kills my animal but does it flagrantly without trying to hide his identity, there is no penalty. And that's really the difference. What the Imrei Yaakov is assuming is that we have the basic knowledge that the difference that the Torah makes between a ganaf and a gazlan is that when a ganaf steals, he commits theft by stealth, so then there's a penalty that is assessed upon him. If he steals an inanimate object, so then he has to pay double of what he stole. So if he steals a wad of $100 from me by stealth, when he's caught, he has to pay back $200 and so forth. But that does not apply to Gezel. If a person robs, he does not have to pay double. He only pays back the principal of what he stole. There's another law in the Torah that if a person steals an animal, and then he goes ahead and he slaughters the animal or sells the animal, so the halacha requires the person who did this through thievery to pay back not only double of what he stole, but 4 or 5 times the amount of what he stole. It's a special penalty assessment on stealing livestock from a person. And it'll depend whether it's 4 or 5 times, depending upon whether he stole a sheep, in which case he pays back 4 times the value of the animal, or whether he steals a larger animal like a cow, in which case he has to pay back 5 times the value of the animal. So it's a very steep penalty that goes on livestock that is not possible to make restitution on, because the anguish that is caused by stealing someone's livestock by stealth is very high. Now, that's only true if he steals it by stealth. But if he goes ahead and flagrantly robs it, so then he only has to make restitution on the animals and does not have to pay back any penalties. Ulam bizmanenu gam ganav patr mehanal lefishu knas v'ha'idna ein danim dine knasos. He says, however, that was all from a biblical standpoint. And today, when a Beis Din assesses how much a person has to pay, it is not within their jurisdiction anymore to assess kinasot, to assess penalties. Today, when a Beis Din requires you to pay, they assess only for actual damages, and they do not include any kinas, any penalties that are added on either by the Torah or by the Chachamim. And that was a rule that the Chachamim accepted upon themselves, that once the Batei Din started to lose their power and their intellectual strength, so there was a collective decision at some point in history to no longer assess kinas or penalty, but rather just to make the principal restitution an obligation. So therefore, on a practical basis nowadays, there really is no difference between a ganaf and a gazlan as far as how much they have to pay back, even though biblically there is that distinction. And we're going to see later on in Siman Tes, when we get to the chapter 9, he says, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Okay. Now, you're not allowed.
Just a point on that. It seemed though then today that you're not really giving any real punishment to the thief, because before there was like a deterrent by having to pay that extra, but today if there's no real deterrent other than just giving back whatever was stolen, it's almost encouraging that behavior to continue.
That is correct. It's not, I wouldn't go that far to say that it's encouraging that behavior, but I would say that there's no real deterrent, because if a person steals, he knows that the worst that will happen is that he'll just have to give it back, but he won't face any further financial repercussions. That's really what you mean to say. Now, you're right. You're 100% right. And the fact of the matter is that the assumption of the Torah is that the laws of stealing were, designed for a biblical holy society. And that when a person steals, his first and primary objective is to remain part of the community of the Jewish people. Once a person is branded as a ganaf in public in the Beis Din, that's a stigma in and of itself that will create a disincentive for a person to continue that behavior. Once society gets larger and it spreads out to, to metropolitan areas where there are Jews and non-Jews alike, then there may be other penalties that can be assessed by the courts to create proper disincentives when people do not feel that sense of loyalty to a community and don't really care about the stigma of being labeled as a criminal. So that's why we have such institutions as jails, we have penalties, we have all of these things, but realize that the based-in system assumes that anyone who's going to go to stay within the Jewish community would not want to be branded as a ganav. And the people who in our community have been branded as a ganav, like if they've gotten embroiled in scandals where they've misappropriated funds, and they exist in every community, including ours, those people have been sort of tarred and feathered in the court of public opinion. And the price that they pay is not only that did they have to make restitution for their crime, but they also have the stigma such that people don't want to have anything to do with them from a financial point of view. And so they have to go outside the community now in order to be able to make a living. So it's important to know that the disincentive is, you're ostracized from the community, not so much the financial disincentive, but the social disincentive. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
All right. Okay. Now, there's also a probe. So we said you're not allowed to be a gazlan or a ganaf. V'im ganaf o gazal chayav v'l'shalei me'idis k'mo mazik. So one of the rules that is set down in the Talmud as far as the nature of compensation is that if all you have is real estate, then the Beis Din will seize your real estate as compensation to the victim. And the Talmud deliberates let's say you have multiple types of real estate. You own different pieces of land. The Talmud has three different classes of real estate. There's idit or idis, beinonis, and ziboris. And those are three terms that talk about the quality of real estate. And the quality of real estate is like high quality, which means the most desirable real estate, like a piece of property on, in downtown Toronto, which will get snatched up in a minute. Then you have average real estate, which is, somewhat desirable, but not premium. Then you have ziboris, which is a lower quality of real estate, which is not as valuable per square foot or per square meter. Okay. Now, even though they're all equal, they're all pieces of property are equal because the piece of ziboris is a larger piece of acreage than the piece of idis. Nonetheless, a person would rather get a piece of idis than a piece of ziboris because it'll be easier to sell and it'll be much less hassle to convert it into cash. And so the rabbi said that when the liable party is completely at fault for malevolent behavior, then they have to pay from their idis, that Beis Din can seize their highest quality real estate as compensation. Whereas for other types of compensation, sometimes, let's say for paying, defaulting on a loan or something like that, the Beis Din will hold you liable for compensation, but they will not seize your idis, they'll only seize your beinonis, okay? So in this case, that's the point of this halacha, that the Beis Din can seize your real estate for compensation and even take your idis, just like if you had caused damage. This is the same halacha. V'hainu im ein lo metaltalin, but we only seize real estate if a person does not have available chattel. Aval im yesh lo metaltalin, nosein lo afilu subin. But if a person has available chattel, then the chattel gets seized before any real estate gets seized, even if the only chattel that's available is bran. Now, what we mean by bran is something that's a very cheap commodity, that you need a big amount of in order for it to amount to anything of value. But that's still called metaltalin, and that takes priority as far as what we seize from a person's assets before we invade into their real estate at all. Dafilu im yesh lo kesef mizuman, and furthermore, the person who committed the offense can choose how he wishes to compensate from his chattel. If he wishes to compensate from his chattel using big bags of bran, then he has a right to do that, even if he has money in his bank. The chol metaltalin mikri meitav, because any chattel is considered to be convertible into cash, easily convertible into cash. And therefore, a person who is assessed by the Beis Din can say, I will pay you in soybeans or whatever commodity I choose to pay you back in. We do give the right to the person who's making compensation to choose what kind of chattel he wishes to pay back. It's only when a person is completely chattel-less that the Beis Din then goes and invades their real estate, and then there's a criterion for what kind of real estate we take from him. Okay? And next halacha dalid. This is a biblical law. It's a din Torah. Dichsiv lo tignovu, as the Torah says, you shall not steal. Umayri beginevas mama, and that pasuk in the Sefer Vayikra is specifically referring to stealing property. Dinilmad mi'inyano dichsiv betzido lo techachashu velo teshakaru, because it's written in the context of property, because the Torah says, do not deny that you have someone's property in your possession. Avalo tignov hakatuv ba'aseret hadibrot ari begonev nefashos. He says, but that's in contradistinction to the prohibition of thou shalt not steal that appears in the Ten Commandments. That is not talking about stealing property, but rather kidnapping. The chayav aleha mita, the penalty for kidnapping someone is the death penalty. It reminds me of that case, where was it, in Cleveland a couple of years ago, where a guy had kidnapped these two young ladies and kept them in his basement for years, right? And he was arrested, put in jail, and he was shortly thereafter murdered in prison, because even the prisoners thought that was the most heinous kind of crime, to hold someone against their will. Well, not surprisingly, the Torah feels the same way also, is that holding someone against their will, kidnapping someone, is considered to be a capital offense, right? So that's the difference between stealing inanimate property, or property, I should say, versus stealing a human being. And stealing someone to sell them into slavery is also a capital offense. And that's also derived from its context, that it's a capital offense, because in the same breath that the Torah says you shall not steal in the Ten Commandments, it also says you shall not murder and you shall not commit adultery. And just like murder and adultery are capital offenses, so too is the stealing of the Ten Commandments a capital offense as well. Therefore, it's not referring to stealing property, but rather is referring to stealing a person, i.e. kidnapping. Okay? So this is where we're going to hold it for today, and we're going to not have shir tomorrow. We will resume then on Monday, Be'ezrat Hashem. Any questions, comments before we break? And before I wish you all a Freilichen Purim, a happy Purim. All right, so a Freilichen Purim, everybody. Those of you who are fasting, have an easy fast. And you too, Wayne. You're almost there. It's almost, fast is almost over by you.
Almost over.
But
only the partying yet to go.
That's right. And tonight is not Purim for you yet, because you're in Yerushalayim. So you're going to be celebrating Purim.
Well, it's actually strange this year. We're doing the Megillah tonight and giving to the poor, and then the Suda is Sunday.
Yeah.
With the, what would it be? The Shalach Manas is also on Sunday.
That's right. So it's called the Purim Mishulash. It's a 3-day Purim in Jerusalem because it's stretched over Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
That's right.
Which is pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm actually speaking about why Purim is spread out over multiple days in my drasha for Shabbos. So I hope you'll have.
Well, record it for me then.
Yeah, well, I record my drasha every Shabbos. I hope some of you at least are watching. It's 10 minutes of your life every week. All right. Have a Freilichen Purim and a good Shabbos, everyone. Take care.